The wind off the Mississippi River cut through downtown Minneapolis like a blade, and Weston Kane stood at the corner of Hennepin Avenue with his hands shoved into the pockets of a coat that no longer had all its buttons. 3 weeks of frost had chapped his knuckles raw. 3 weeks of thin coffee shop soup and gas station bread had hollowed his cheeks until his own reflection in a storefront window looked for a moment like a stranger. He almost didn't recognize the laughter before he recognized the faces. "Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, Jess, look, is that him? Tell me that's not him." Kayla Preston's voice sliced through the cold, bright and cruel, the kind of voice that had once cheered for him across a college quad a decade earlier. Jess Monroe lifted her phone before she'd even finished laughing, angling the camera the way people angle cameras at accidents, unable to look away, unwilling to help. "It is him, Weston Kane. Look at you." Kayla circled him slowly the way a person circles roadkill. The guy who used to talk about building something bigger than his father ever did. Big dreams, big talk. She laughed again, sharper this time. "And here you are, on a curb, in a coat from a dumpster." Weston said nothing. He had learned in 3 weeks of living without a name that meant anything that silence cost less than dignity did. "Say something," Jess pressed, phone still raised, red light blinking. "Come on, smile for the camera. Big shot Weston Kane, everybody. Somebody tell his old man to come pick him up." "Oh wait." Her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He can't. He's dead. Guess the Empire didn't need a prince after all." The words landed somewhere under Weston's ribs, somewhere old and unhealed, and for one unguarded second, something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, but a grief so raw it looked almost like fear. He turned his face toward the gray river beyond the buildings so the two women wouldn't see it. "This is going online tonight," Kayla called after him as they walked away, still laughing, their boots crunching confidently through snow he had to walk around because his own shoes had split at the seams. "Everyone's going to see exactly what happened to Golden Boy Kane." Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. He watched them go. He did not chase an explanation. There was no explanation he could give that wouldn't undo. The only thing he had left: the disguise, the silence, the slow and desperate search for a single person in this city who might look at a broken man and see something worth kneeling down for. 9 more days, he told himself, the way he told himself every morning. Now a private countdown ticking somewhere under the ache in his chest. 9 more days, and if I find no one, I stop looking. The night came down early, the way it always did in a Minnesota winter, swallowing the last gray light before 5 o'clock. Weston found a doorway 2 blocks from a laundromat out of the worst of the wind and lowered himself onto the cold concrete. His body had stopped fighting the exhaustion days ago. Hunger had become a dull, permanent hum beneath his skin, and sleep, real sleep, the kind that didn't startle awake at every passing siren, felt like something that belonged to another man's life entirely. He thought of his father sometimes in these hours, Frank Kane, who had built Kane Milling Company out of one leased grain elevator and a debt he refused to speak of, who had taught his son that a person's worth was never printed on a paycheck. Weston thought too of the mother who had left when he was 8 years old, a memory he kept locked so far down that even exhaustion rarely dragged it up. Tonight, though, with Kayla's laughter still ringing faintly in his ears, the old wound opened anyway, quiet and aching the way old wounds do in the cold. Big shot Weston Kane, he thought bitterly. They see the name and never once ask what it cost. Somewhere past midnight, the cold stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing at all. That he would later understand was the dangerous part. His vision blurred at the edges. The streetlights smeared into long yellow streaks. He tried to stand, some instinct telling him to keep moving, to not let this be the night the disguise became the truth, and the sidewalk tilted up to meet him. He did not remember falling. Olivia Hendricks was walking home from the 11 o'clock shift at the laundromat on Lyndale Avenue, her breath fogging in front of her, a thin canvas coat pulled tight against a wind that seemed determined to find every gap in it, when she saw the shape slumped against the brick wall ahead of her. For a moment, she almost crossed the street. The city had taught her caution the way it taught everyone caution. A low hum of warnings: don't stop, don't look, keep walking, that lived in the back of every woman's mind after dark. But then the shape didn't move. Not even a shiver. And something in Olivia, something stubborn, something that had survived its own share of cold nights, would not let her keep walking. Sir, she crouched a few feet away, first cautious, calling out before she got close. Sir, can you hear me? Nothing. Up close in the wash of the street lamp, she could see him clearly. Now a man younger than she'd expected. His face gaunt, beneath days of stubble. His lips faintly blue at the edges. His coat was too thin for the night. His hands, when she finally reached out and touched one, were cold in a way that frightened her. Oh, okay. Okay, hey, wake up. Her voice climbed urgent now, fear cutting through her caution. She shook his shoulder harder. A faint groan answered her, and his eyelids fluttered unfocused, somewhere between consciousness and collapse. Relief hit her almost as hard as the fear had. She thought for one practical second about calling for an ambulance she couldn't afford to have called on her behalf, about a shelter 3 blocks away that closed intake at 10. Neither option would get him warm in the next 5 minutes, and 5 minutes looking at him felt like all the time he had. Okay, I've got you. She said it more to steady herself than him. She got an arm under his shoulders, surprised at how little resistance his body gave, how frighteningly light he felt for a man his height. Come on, just a little further. My place isn't far. It took nearly 15 minutes to walk 2 blocks, half carrying a stranger through slush and shadow, her own muscles, screaming, her mind circling every reason this was reckless and every reason she couldn't leave him there. Anyway, by the time she got him through her apartment door and onto the second-hand couch that had come with the place, her arms were shaking and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She peeled off his soaked coat. She found the extra blanket in the hall closet, the one her grandmother had made, and wrapped it around him with hands that trembled from cold and adrenaline both. She heated the last of a can of chicken soup on the stove, and when his eyes finally opened, clouded, confused, searching the unfamiliar ceiling, she was kneeling beside him with a spoon and a bowl and no idea, none at all, that the man she'd carried in off the street was worth more money than the entire block she lived on. Easy, she said softly when his breath caught in panic at the unfamiliar room. You're safe. You collapsed outside. I couldn't leave you there. Weston stared at her at the tired, kind, unguarded face, leaning over him in a cramped apartment that smelled like someone else's grandmother's soup. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the countdown in his chest went quiet. Morning came slow and gray through Olivia Hendricks's kitchen window, the kind of Minneapolis dawn that seemed to arrive reluctantly, as if the sun itself were still deciding whether the city deserved it. Weston Kane woke to the smell of burnt toast and the low murmur of a radio turned down almost to nothing, and for several long seconds he did not know where he was. The ceiling was unfamiliar, water-stained in one corner, a single crack running like a river toward the light fixture. The blanket over him was hand-stitched, mismatched squares of fabric sewn together by someone who clearly hadn't cared whether the pattern matched, only that it kept out the cold. His body ached in a way that felt almost foreign after 3 weeks of numbness, not the ache of the street, but the strange, disorienting ache of having actually rested. He sat up too fast. The room tilted and a wave of dizziness rolled through him, dragging a small, involuntary sound out of his throat. Hey, easy. Don't sit up like that. Olivia appeared in the kitchen doorway, dish towel still in her hand, her expression caught somewhere between relief and concern. You've been out cold since I got you in here. I was starting to wonder if I should have called someone after all. Weston blinked at her, and for a moment his instincts, 3 weeks of trained, careful instincts, screamed at him to lie, to deflect, to give her nothing that could be traced back to a name that meant anything. But looking at her, at the exhaustion under her eyes that told him she'd probably sat up half the night checking whether he was still breathing, something in him resisted the lie at least part way. I'm okay, he managed, his voice rough, unused. Thank you. For he stopped searching for words that felt inadequate to the size of what she'd done. For not walking past me. Anyone would have stopped. She said it simply, moving to the small stove, ladling something into a chipped mug. You collapsed. What was I supposed to do, step over you? You'd be surprised, he almost said, thinking of Kayla Preston's laughter still ringing faintly in his memory of a phone camera aimed at him like a weapon. Instead, he said nothing, and accepted the mug she handed him, instant, coffee, weak, and slightly bitter, and somehow, the best thing he'd tasted in 3 weeks. What's your name? She asked, settling into the chair across from the couch, careful, unhurried, the way a person asks a question they suspect might not get a full answer. He hesitated. The name Weston Kane belonged to boardrooms and headlines, to a company that occupied 4 city blocks and employed 11,000 people, to obituaries and shareholder letters, and a father's legacy he still wasn't sure he deserved. It did not belong here in this small apartment that smelled like burnt toast and kindness. West, he said finally. Not a lie. Just not the whole truth. Just West. Olivia. She offered a small, tired smile. Olivia Hendricks. They sat with that for a moment, two names exchanged across a chipped mug of coffee, the kind of quiet that should have felt awkward between strangers and somehow didn't. You should eat something, she said eventually, standing already moving toward the kitchen again with the brisk efficiency of someone used to taking care of things without being asked. I don't have much, but there's eggs. And I think there's still some bread that isn't burnt. Weston watched her go, and something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. He had spent 3 weeks searching for exactly this, a stranger, a test proof, that somewhere in this city there existed a person who gave without calculating what they might get back. He had told himself it was an experiment, a controlled search with a 9-day deadline, a problem to be solved the way he solved every other problem methodically at arm's length. He had not prepared himself for what it would feel like to actually receive it, to sit in a stranger's kitchen, wrapped in a blanket someone's grandmother had made by hand and feel for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit something close to being seen. You said not many people would stop, Olivia said from the kitchen, cracking eggs into a pan that had clearly survived more years than it should have. Like you already knew that, like you'd tested it before. Weston's jaw tightened. She was more perceptive than he'd accounted for. I've learned a few things, he said carefully, about who stops and who doesn't. That sounds like a sad way to learn something. It was. The word came out before he could stop it quieter than he meant it, carrying more weight than the sentence should have held. He looked down at the mug in his hands. It's been a hard few years. Olivia didn't push. She set a plate in front of him, eggs, the least burnt slice of toast, arranged with a care that suggested she didn't have much practice cooking for anyone but herself, and sat back down across from him, watching him eat with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pity. He'd had enough pity thrown at him in 3 weeks to recognize it instantly, and this wasn't that. It looked more like patience, like someone leaving a door open without demanding he walk through it. Can I ask you something, she said after a while. He nodded, chewing slowly, savoring food in a way he hadn't in weeks. Do you have family? Anyone I should call, let them know you're okay? The question landed harder than she could have known. Weston set down his fork. My father passed a few years back, he said, choosing the words the way a man chooses footing on ice. He had a business. I took it over. It's just been me since. What about your mom? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt to Weston like falling through thin ice into water that never actually thawed. He thought of a woman's coat disappearing through a doorway when he was 8 years old, of a house that got quieter and quieter, in the months after, of a father who never once spoke her name again, and taught his son without ever meaning to that love could simply decide to leave and take everything warm in a house along with it. She left, he said finally flatly, the way a person says something they've practiced saying without feeling it. A long time ago. I don't really, he stopped. Started again. It's been a long time since anyone took care of me the way you did last night. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. Olivia's expression softened, something aching and understanding passing behind her eyes, though she didn't press further. She simply reached over and refilled his mug without being asked, the gesture itself, an answer to a question he hadn't voiced. You don't have to explain the rest. They talked for another hour about small things, careful things, the weather, the laundromat where she worked nights, a neighbor's dog that barked at every delivery truck on the block, and Weston found himself for the first time in 3 weeks not counting down the days until the gala, not calculating the next test, not measuring the distance between himself and the boardroom waiting for his return. He was simply there, in a small kitchen with cracked linoleum, and a woman who had no idea she'd just carried a piece of Kane Milling Company's fortune 2 blocks through the snow, on nothing but instinct and stubbornness. When he finally stood to leave later than he should have, later than was safe for either of them, Olivia walked him to the door, pressing a granola bar into his coat pocket without a word, the last one in her cupboard by the look of the shelf, behind her. Take care of yourself, West, she said, and maybe find somewhere warmer to be tonight. He paused on the threshold, looking at her, really, looking the way he hadn't let himself look at anyone in 3 years, and something in his chest ached, with a feeling he couldn't yet name. Not gratitude alone, not curiosity alone. Something deeper and more dangerous than either. I will, he said. Thank you, Olivia. For everything. He walked away into the gray morning with a granola bar in his pocket, and her name settling somewhere in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples he had no way yet of knowing would reach every corner of his carefully guarded life. Behind him, unseen, a black car idled at the far end of the block. Inside it, a man lowered a pair of binoculars, lifted a phone, and typed a single message before pulling away into traffic. Confirmed. He's still in the city. Tell Derek. The offices of Kane Milling Company occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower overlooking the Mississippi, and even at 7 in the morning, the 42nd floor hummed with quiet, expensive efficiency assistants moving through corridors with tablets, coffee machines, sighing, steam the whole building running itself in the practiced rhythm of an empire that no longer needed its founder's grandson standing in the room to keep functioning. Charlie Donovan sat alone in the corner office that wasn't his by title, but had been his in practice for the better part of a decade, a cane resting against the edge of his desk, 3 monitors glowing in front of him with columns of numbers that most people would have found unbearably dull, and that Charlie found this particular morning deeply alarming. He had grown up beside Weston Kane in circumstances. Neither of them spoke about much anymore. A state group home outside Duluth, 2 boys with nothing in common except a shared bunk room, and the particular loneliness of being nobody's first choice. A childhood illness had left Charlie's left leg weaker than it should have been, slower, prone to buckling under him without warning, and while other boys had learned to run, Charlie had learned to watch, to notice. It was Weston-like to say, the reason Charlie Donovan had become the best financial mind in the company, and the only person alive Weston trusted without reservation, which was precisely why the numbers on his screen troubled him so deeply. He picked up his phone and dialed a number that rang twice before going to voicemail, the same as it had every morning for 3 weeks. He didn't bother leaving a message this time. Instead, he sat back, rubbed a hand over his tired eyes, and allowed himself for just a moment the anger he'd been swallowing since Weston first announced this plan. A month, Weston had told him, sitting in this very office, jaw set with the particular stubbornness that had gotten him through business school on scholarship money, and gotten him later through the hardest year of his life after his father's funeral. 1 month living on the street, no name, no money, no company behind me. I need to know if there's a single person left in this world who'd help a man with nothing to offer back. Charlie had argued against it for 2 hours. He'd argued that grief didn't need an experiment, it needed time. He'd argued that a billionaire disappearing from public view for a month was the kind of thing that made headlines, made enemies bold, made vultures circle. Weston had listened to every word, thanked him for his honesty, and disappeared into the city anyway 3 days later. Charlie had respected the decision. He had not in 3 weeks stopped worrying about it. And now the numbers in front of him gave that worry a name. A knock sounded at his door, and Priya Anand, the company's head of security, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd come up through corporate risk consulting before Kane Milling hired her away, stepped inside without waiting for an answer, closing the door behind her with a firmness that told Charlie this wasn't a casual visit. "You need to see this," she said, setting a folder on his desk. "Surveillance flagged unusual account activity 2 nights ago. Shell company out of Chicago routed through 3 different holding accounts before it lands anywhere traceable. It's small enough that it wouldn't have tripped anything 6 months ago. But given who's been asking about Weston's location lately, Derek." Charlie said the name flatly, the way a man names a diagnosis he's suspected for a long time and finally has confirmation for. Priya nodded. "Someone matching a private investigator's profile has been asking questions around the areas Weston's been seen. Shelters, soup kitchens, a laundromat on Lyndale." She paused, watching Charlie's face carefully. "Someone's tracking him, Charlie. And it's not us." Charlie's grip tightened on the arm of his chair, his knuckles going pale. He thought of Weston's father, Frank Kane, dead, 9 years now, in a highway accident just outside the Twin Cities, that the police report had called unavoidable black ice, a jackknifed semi-truck. Nothing anyone could have prevented. Charlie had never questioned it. Not once in 9 years had it occurred to him to question it. It occurred to him now. "Pull everything on the accident report," Charlie said, his voice low, urgent. "Everything. The insurance filing, the police report, the maintenance logs on Frank's vehicle. All of it. Today." Priya's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't ask why. She simply nodded and left, and Charlie sat alone in the sudden silence of his office, staring at numbers. He no longer had the stomach to read his mind, circling a possibility so ugly he hadn't allowed himself to consider it until this. A moment that his best friend, the closest thing to a brother, Charlie Donovan had ever had, was not merely testing strangers on the streets of Minneapolis out of grief. He might be hiding, and whoever he was hiding from might already know exactly where to find him. Charlie reached for his cane, pushed himself up from the chair with the slow, deliberate effort his leg always demanded of him, and crossed to the window. 42 floors below the city spread out gray and indifferent under a sky that threatened more snow, and somewhere in that maze of streets and shelters and soup kitchens, Weston Kane was walking around with no name and no protection, believing the only danger in his life was whether he'd find someone honest enough to trust. You have no idea, Charlie thought, his jaw tight. You have no idea what you might actually be walking into. He picked up his phone again, and this time, instead of calling, he typed a message he'd been putting off for 3 days out of respect for his friend's wishes. We need to talk. Tonight. It's not about the plan anymore. It's about your safety. Please, West, call me back. He hesitated over the name for a moment, the private nickname the two of them had used since boyhood, back before either of them had titles or fortunes or empires to protect, back when they were just two boys in a group home who'd promised each other half-jokingly, half-desperately that whichever one of them made it out first would come back for the other. Weston had made it out first. He'd come back for Charlie exactly as promised, pulled him out of an accounting internship that was going nowhere, and given him a corner office and a seat at every table that mattered. Charlie had spent a decade trying to be worth that faith, steady, careful, the man who caught what everyone else missed. He was not going to fail him now. He sent the message, set the phone down, and turned back to the folder Priya had left on his desk, the words, "Assistant Report Frank Kane," sitting at the top of the first page like something that had been waiting 9 years to be reopened. Outside, the first flakes of a new snowfall began drifting past the window, soft and silent and utterly indifferent to the storm gathering underneath the surface of the city below. Charlie opened the folder and began to read. The message sat unanswered on Charlie Donovan's phone for the better part of a day, and by the time evening settled over Minneapolis streetlights flickering on one by one along Hennepin Avenue, snow collecting in thin white lines along windowsills, his patience had worn down to something closer, to fear. He found Weston finally not through the phone but through Priya Anand's quiet, careful surveillance of a laundromat on Lyndale Avenue, the same block where a young woman named Olivia Hendricks worked the night shift. Charlie didn't like using surveillance on his own friend. It felt like a betrayal of the very privacy Weston had begged for when he started this whole reckless experiment. But fear made its own rules, and Charlie's fear by that point had outgrown his manners. He found Weston in an alley 2 blocks from the laundromat, sitting on an overturned milk crate, a paper cup of gas station coffee cooling in his hands, looking so thoroughly unlike the man who ran Kane Milling Company that for one disorienting second, even Charlie, who had known him for over 20 years, almost didn't recognize him. "You look terrible," Charlie said, easing himself down onto a nearby step, his cane clicking softly against the concrete. Weston looked up startled, then managed something close to a tired laugh. "You drove all the way down here to tell me that?" "I drove all the way down here," Charlie said, "because you stopped answering your phone and because I found something I can't sit on anymore." He held out the folder he'd carried under his coat, the pages inside slightly bent from being pressed against his ribs the whole drive over. "You need to see this. Tonight. Before you go one more day thinking you're only out here testing strangers." Something in Charlie's voice, a note Weston hadn't heard from his friend since the week of Frank Kane's funeral, made Weston set down the coffee cup and take the folder without argument. "What is it? Read it." Weston opened the folder under the weak orange light of a street lamp, and Charlie watched his friend's face change as he read confusion first, then a stillness that was almost worse than any visible reaction, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow before his body has decided how to respond to it. The first page was the original police report from the night Frank Kane died, a highway accident outside the Twin Cities black ice. A jackknifed semi-truck ruled unavoidable 9 years ago, and never once questioned since. The second page was new. A maintenance log pulled from records Charlie had spent the entire day tracking down, showing that Frank Kane's vehicle had been serviced 2 days before the accident, not at the dealership Frank always used, but at an independent garage that, according to state business filings, had been quietly owned at the time by a shell company traced through 3 separate holding accounts back to Derek Kane, Weston's cousin. "That's not proof of anything," Weston said quietly, though his voice had gone thin, strained, the voice of a man trying to talk himself out of a conclusion his gut had already reached. "Anyone could have owned that garage. It doesn't mean—" "There's more," Charlie said, gently nodding toward the next page. "The brake lines were flagged as serviced. Except 3 independent mechanics I had look at this today all said the same thing. The wear pattern on the brake components recovered from the wreck doesn't match fresh service work. It matches components that had been deliberately compromised and made to look worn." The silence that followed stretched long enough that a car passed at the end of the alley, its headlights sweeping briefly across Weston's face. illuminating an expression Charlie had never seen on him before. Not grief exactly, though. Grief was there buried under something colder and more disorienting. It was the particular horror of a man realizing that a story he had told himself for 9 years, a story that had let him grieve cleanly without complication, was not the true story at all. Derek Weston said, finally, the name coming out of him like something torn loose. Derek did this. I don't know that for certain, Charlie said carefully. I know the ownership trail. I know the timing. I know it's enough to be terrifying and not enough yet to be proof a court would accept. But Weston. He hesitated, and for the first time in the conversation, his own composure cracked slightly, the fear he'd been carrying all day finally breaking the surface. There's someone watching you. Right now. Tonight. A man matching a private investigator's description has been seen near the shelters, near the soup kitchens, near this exact block. Whoever it is, they've been asking questions about a homeless man matching your description for over a week. Weston's hand tightened around the folder until the edges of the pages crumpled beneath his fingers. He thought of his father, steady, patient, Frank Kane, who used to sit at the kitchen table late into the night doing inventory by hand, because he didn't trust anyone else to get it right, who had raised Weston alone after his wife walked out, who had built an entire company out of nothing but stubbornness, and the belief that a person's worth wasn't measured by what they were born with. Frank had never once in Weston's entire life spoken an unkind word about his nephew Derek, even when Derek had spent years quietly maneuvering for a larger share of the company than his branch of the family had ever been entitled to. He was at the funeral, Weston said, almost to himself, staring at nothing. He stood right next to me at the funeral, Charlie. He put his hand on my shoulder. I know. If this is true, Weston's voice broke slightly and he pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes for a moment, breathing hard, fighting something that felt dangerously close to unraveling in the middle of a cold alley, 2 blocks from a laundromat. If this is true, then everything I thought I understood about that day is a lie. My father didn't die in an accident. He was murdered. By family. Charlie reached over, placing a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder, the same gesture Weston realized distantly that Derek had made at the funeral, and the thought made something in his stomach turn. I should have told you to come in from the street the second I found this, Charlie said quietly. I should have called you the moment Priya brought me the account activity. I didn't want to interrupt whatever this experiment has meant to you. That was wrong of me. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Weston shook his head slowly, forcing air back into his lungs, forcing the shaking in his hands to still. You just handed me the truth. Nobody else in 9 years bothered to look hard enough to find it. They sat together in the cold for a long moment, the city humming quietly around them, indifferent to the weight of what had just shifted between 2 men who had once been nothing but 2 frightened boys, sharing a bunk room, promising each other they'd look out for one another no matter what came. So what happens now? Charlie asked finally. Do you come in, call off the plan? Let security handle this properly. Weston was quiet for a long time, staring down the alley toward the faint glow of Lyndale Avenue, toward the laundromat where 2 nights ago a stranger named Olivia Hendricks had knelt beside a collapsed man in the snow and chosen without hesitation to carry him to safety. No, he said finally, quietly, but with a resolve that settled something back into place behind his eyes. Not yet. If Derek's watching, then coming in now just tells him he's rattled me. I need more time, a few more days at least, to figure out how deep this goes before I walk back into that building. He looked at Charlie, and something in his expression, grief-stricken as it was, had steadied. But I need you watching my back out here now, Charlie. Quietly. No security detail that'll spook whoever's circling. Just you. Charlie studied his friend for a long moment, thinner than Weston had ever been exhausted, grieving a truth he'd only just learned, and still somehow more resolved than Charlie had seen him since the week of the funeral. You've got it, Charlie said. Always have. Above them, snow continued to drift down through the orange glow of the street lamp, settling silently over the alley, over the folder still clutched in Weston's hand, over a city that had no idea it was quietly becoming the battleground for a war 9 years in the making. The soup kitchen on Franklin Avenue opened its doors at 5 o'clock every evening, a low brick building with fogged windows and a hand-painted sign that had been repainted so many times. The lettering had grown slightly uneven, like handwriting that had aged along with the people who maintained it. Steam curled out through the prop door into the cold, carrying the smell of chicken broth and coffee, and a line had already formed along the sidewalk by the time Weston Kane took his place near the back of it, collar turned up against the wind cap, pulled low. He told himself he came for the food. He had told himself that for 2 nights running now, and both nights he had known somewhere beneath the surface of the lie that it wasn't entirely true. He saw her before she saw him, Olivia Hendricks, off her laundromat shift early, standing near the folding tables just inside the door, ladling soup into paper bowls with the kind of easy, unhurried patience that made the volunteers around her look by comparison like they were merely fulfilling an obligation. She said something to an elderly man at the front of the line that made him laugh, a real laugh, the kind that softened the tired lines around his eyes. And Weston felt something in his own chest loosen just from watching it. West. Her face lit when she reached him in the line, surprised and pleased in a way she didn't try to hide. "Hey, I didn't expect to see you here. Had to eat somewhere," he said, offering a small, careful smile. "Well, you're in luck. Tonight's chicken and rice." She ladled a generous portion into his bowl, more than she'd given the man before him, and when he opened his mouth to point that out, she simply raised an eyebrow and dared him to say something about it. He didn't. They ended up at the same folding table near the back of the room, an unspoken arrangement that neither of them acknowledged out loud, and for the better part of an hour, Weston Kane, chairman of a company that owned 4 city blocks, employed 11,000 people, sat elbow to elbow with strangers, on metal folding chairs, eating chicken and rice out of a paper bowl, and felt more at peace than he had in longer than he wanted to admit. "You're quiet tonight," Olivia said midway through the meal, studying him with the same patient attentiveness she'd shown the morning after she'd found him in the snow. "Just thinking. About—" He hesitated. The truth sat behind his teeth, enormous and impossible. "My cousin may have arranged my father's death, and now someone may be hunting me through the streets of this city, and I still can't stop thinking about the sound of your voice. When you told me I was safe, none of it was sayable. Not here, not yet, maybe not ever. About how strange it is," he said, instead choosing a smaller, truer piece of the larger truth that the kindest thing that's happened to me in years happened on a night I don't even remember falling down. Olivia's expression softened, something careful and searching in it. "You still haven't told me much about yourself. Where you're from. What happened before?" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the soup kitchen, the folding table, the life he was currently living without a name that meant anything. "It's complicated," Weston said, and it was more complicated than she could possibly imagine, but the deflection cost him something, this time a small wince he couldn't quite hide. "You don't have to tell me," she said gently. "I'm not asking because I think you owe me an explanation for a bowl of soup. I'm asking because," she paused, seeming to search for the honest version of her own sentence, "because I think about you, more than I probably should for someone I've known 3 days." The admission hung between them, fragile and unguarded, and Weston felt something crack open in his chest that he had kept carefully sealed since he was 8 years old, and watched his mother's coat disappear through a doorway for the last time. He had built an entire life around never being the first to admit he needed anyone. He had built a fortune on it in some strange, backward way. The relentless drive of a boy who decided that if love could simply leave, he would make himself so successful that no one would ever have a reason to leave again. And here was a woman with a chipped coffee mug and a hand-stitched blanket telling him without any leverage or expectation that she thought about him. "I think about you too," he said quietly, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in years. Across the room near the door, a phone camera lifted. Weston didn't notice it. He was too absorbed in the moment at the table, in the particular warmth of being looked at by someone who wanted nothing from him. But Olivia caught the motion out of the corner of her eye and recognized with a small sinking feeling the 2 women holding the phone. Kayla Preston and Jess Monroe had come to the soup kitchen as part of a volunteer shift arranged ironically by Jess's employer for a company holiday photo opportunity, the kind of one-day charity appearance that photographed well for a corporate newsletter and required almost no actual commitment to the people being served. They had not expected to find their old classmate sitting at a folding table with a laundry worker from Hennepin Avenue, and the sight of it, Weston Kane, disheveled and diminished. Apparently making friends with the help was too good in Kayla's estimation to let pass. "Oh my God, is that your new boyfriend?" Kayla's voice carried across the room, pitched just loud enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby tables. She approached with her phone still raised, recording. "Careful, sweetie. Word of advice that one's all charm and no follow-through. Ask around." Olivia's spine straightened, her expression cooling instantly into something protective. "I don't think anyone asked you. I'm just being neighborly." Kayla's smile didn't reach her eyes. She turned the camera toward Weston, who had gone very still, his jaw tight, every muscle in his body braced against exposure. "Say hi to the internet, Weston. Tell everyone how the mighty have fallen." "Kayla." Jess's voice, uncertain, now tugged at her friend's sleeve, some flicker of conscience surfacing too late. "Maybe we should." "No, it's fine." Kayla shook her off, laughing already, typing something into her phone with her free hand, clearly composing the caption before she'd even finished filming. This is basically a public service announcement. People deserve to know. Weston said nothing. He had learned in the last few weeks that silence was armor, that any word he offered in his own defense only gave people like Kayla more to twist. But this time, for the first time, the silence cost him something different. Not just pride, but the fear of what it might cost. Olivia, sitting beside him, watching her new friend get filmed and mocked without understanding any of the reasons. Why? That's enough. Olivia's voice cut across the room, quiet but absolutely firm, the same steel that had carried a collapsed stranger 2 blocks through the snow without a second thought. You've had your fun. Now leave. Kayla's eyebrows rose, amused. Or what? Or I make sure every volunteer coordinator in this building knows exactly what you used their soup kitchen for tonight. Olivia held her gaze, unflinching. Your call. Something in Olivia's steadiness, the total absence of fear in a woman with far less to protect herself with than Kayla, had seemed to unsettle Kayla more than any threat could have. She lowered the phone slowly, glancing once more at Weston with an expression that had curdled from amusement into something almost uncomfortable, and turned away without another word. Jess trailing behind her with a backward glance that carried unexpectedly something like an apology. The room settled back into its ordinary hum, spoons against paper bowls, low conversation, the hiss of the coffee urn. But Weston sat very still, staring at the table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. You didn't have to do that, he said finally, quietly. Yes, I did. Olivia's voice had softened again, the steel from a moment ago already, dissolving back into the gentleness he'd come to recognize as simply who she was. Nobody gets to talk to someone like that in front of me and just walk away clean. Not while I'm sitting here. Weston looked at her, at the fierce, unhesitating way she had stood between him and humiliation, without knowing a single true fact about who he was or what he was worth, and something in his chest, some old and carefully guarded wall, cracked, another inch wider. Olivia, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. There's a lot about me you don't know. When I find out, she said, gently cutting him off, meeting his eyes without flinching, I'll still be sitting right here. Whatever it is. Outside, the wind picked up against the fogged windows, and neither of them noticed the black car idling across the street, nor the man inside it lowering a camera lens, capturing the whole exchange in patient, silent detail. A few days later, the morning arrived with a rare break in the clouds, pale winter sunlight slanting low across the rooftops of South Minneapolis, and catching for once on something other than gray slush and tired brick. Olivia Hendricks stood in her kitchen in a blouse, she'd ironed twice, smoothing invisible wrinkles out of the fabric, with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking since the phone call the evening before. Congratulations, Miss Hendricks. We'd like to offer you the position of logistics coordinator starting 2 weeks from Monday. She had said thank you 3 times before she remembered to hang up, and then she had sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, simply breathing, letting the news settle into a body that had spent the last several years bracing itself against disappointment as a kind of habit. The company was called Meridian Freight Solutions, a mid-sized logistics firm with offices downtown, and Olivia had applied on a whim after seeing the listing pinned to a community bulletin board outside the public library. Steady hours, benefits after 90 days, a salary that would let her, for the first time in longer than she wanted to think about, stop counting quarters before she did laundry. What the listing hadn't mentioned, and what Olivia had no reason to ever suspect, was that Meridian Freight Solutions operated as a wholly owned subsidiary of Kane Milling Company, one of 40 smaller businesses folded quietly under the umbrella of an empire whose chairman she currently knew only as a soft-spoken man named West, who slept some nights in doorways, 2 blocks from her apartment. She told him the news that evening, finding him exactly where she now half expected to find him most evenings, near the soup kitchen on Franklin Avenue, waiting, though he never quite admitted that's what he was doing for the hours. She got off shift. I got it, she said before he'd even fully turned to face her, the words tumbling out with an unguarded joy that made her look for a moment years younger than the tired weight she usually carried. The logistics job. I start in 2 weeks. Weston felt something bloom, warm and unexpected in his chest, a happiness so immediate and so entirely uncomplicated that it startled him. In the boardroom, good news arrived, wrapped in spreadsheets and quarterly projections filtered through so many layers of calculation that by the time it reached him, it had lost most of its capacity to simply feel like joy. This, a woman's face lit up on a cold sidewalk over a job that would, by his own company's pay scale, barely register as a rounding error. This felt like something he had forgotten was possible to feel at all. Olivia, that's wonderful. He meant it so completely that his voice caught slightly on the words. You deserve this. More than you know. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and it'll turn out to be a mistake, she admitted, laughing a little at herself, though something uncertain flickered behind the laughter. Things like this don't usually happen to people like me. Not without some catch waiting on the other side of it. The observation landed somewhere tender and complicated in Weston, because he understood better than she could know exactly how true that statement had been for most of the world's history, and exactly how much power he currently possessed and was currently concealing from her, could be used either to prove her right or to finally quietly prove her wrong. Maybe this is just good luck, he said carefully. Maybe not everything has a catch. Maybe. She didn't sound entirely convinced, but she let it go, tucking her hands into her coat pockets against the cold. I keep thinking about my dad, actually. He used to say that whenever something good happened, that you had to be careful not to let good news make you soft because life liked to test you right when you started feeling steady. A small, wistful smile crossed her face, the kind that carried grief carefully folded inside it. He would have liked this job. He always wanted me doing something with numbers. Said I had a mind for it. He sounds like he was a good man. Something shifted briefly behind Olivia's eyes, a shadow passing quickly, and then just as quickly tucked away the way people learn to fold grief into small, manageable shapes when they've had years of practice carrying it. He was, she said quietly. He worked hard. Harder than anyone should have to, honestly. It didn't. She stopped herself, shook her head slightly, and offered a small apologetic smile. Sorry, it's an old story, not a happy one. I don't like bringing it up. Weston wanted badly to press further, some instinct in him recognizing without yet understanding why that the shape of her father's story mattered, that the shadow crossing her face was not an ordinary grief but one with edges and specifics he needed to know. But he held himself back, sensing that this was not the night for it, that trust between two people built itself in careful layers, and he had no right yet to the deepest ones. You don't have to explain anything to me, he said instead, echoing without quite realizing it the exact words she had once offered him. Whenever you're ready. If you're ever ready. She looked at him for a long moment, something grateful and slightly surprised in her expression, as though she hadn't expected the gentleness to be returned so easily. Thank you, she said softly. That's not everyone would say that. They walked together for a while after that, not toward anywhere in particular, simply matching pace along the quiet evening streets, past storefronts, glowing warm against the early dark, past a corner church with its doors propped open for evening service, past a small bakery pulling in its sidewalk, sign for the night. Weston found himself more than once forgetting entirely the countdown ticking in the back of his mind, the 9 days that had become 6. The deadline of the gala drawing steadily closer, the shadow of Derek Kane's shell company still hanging unresolved somewhere behind every quiet moment like this one. Can I ask you something, Olivia said. As they reached the corner near her apartment building, the streetlight above them, flickering faintly, undecided about whether to fully come on. Anything. Why do you keep coming back? To the soup kitchen, I mean. She gestured vaguely between them. This. Whatever this is. You could disappear tomorrow and I'd never even know your last name. I don't understand why you keep choosing to be here instead. Weston looked at her for a long moment, the honest answer rising in his throat with more force than he expected, and for once standing on a quiet street corner with the streetlight flickering uncertainly above them, he let a piece of truth through. Because you're the first person in longer than I can remember, he said quietly, who's made me feel like being cared for wasn't something I had to earn first. Olivia's breath caught slightly, something soft and unguarded passing across her face. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the space between them charged with a tenderness neither one seemed entirely prepared for. Well, she said finally, her voice a little unsteady. For what it's worth, you don't have to earn it. Not with me. She reached out briefly and squeezed his hand, cold fingers against cold fingers. An unremarkable gesture that nonetheless landed in Weston's chest with the force of something in lions, something he hadn't let himself feel since he was a child, small enough to still believe that love simply stayed, no conditions, no earning required. Get some rest tonight, West, she said, stepping back toward her building. And congratulate me properly once I've actually survived my first day. I will, he promised, watching her disappear through the door, the porch light catching briefly on her hair before it swung shut behind her. He stood alone on the sidewalk for a long while afterward, the cold settling back in around him now that her warmth had gone, and allowed himself for the first time in weeks to imagine carefully, guardedly, like a man testing ice he wasn't yet sure would hold his weight, what it might feel like to tell her everything. His name, his company, the father he'd lost and the cousin he now feared. And beneath all of it quietly the growing certainty that whatever this was between them, it had already become something far too important to lose to a lie. Above him, unnoticed, a light rain began to turn slowly to snow, and 2 blocks away in a parked car with its engine idling low, a man lifted a camera and photographed the empty street where moments before Weston Kane had been standing. Diane Hendricks lived in a small rented house in northeast Minneapolis, the kind of narrow 2-story with a sagging porch and a yard that had gone to seed years before Olivia had left for her own apartment across the river. The house smelled the same as it always had: old coffee, faint mildew from a basement that never quite dried out, and beneath it all the particular mustiness of furniture that had outlived its usefulness but never its sentimental value. Olivia came for dinner most Sundays, a habit she'd never quite been able to break even in the years when her mother's company felt more like an obligation than a comfort. She let herself in with her own key, calling out a greeting that was met as it usually was, by the sound of a television turned up slightly too loud in the next room. "You're late," Diane said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring on the stove. She was a thin woman, sharp-featured with the kind of permanently tired eyes that came from decades of worrying about money she'd never quite had enough of. "I made stew. It's probably cold by now. I'm 15 minutes late, Mom." Olivia hung her coat by the door, the same coat she'd worn the night she'd found Weston collapsed in the snow, though her mother had no idea of that, and wouldn't have approved of it if she had. The bus was running behind. Diane ladled stew into 2 bowls without further comment, setting them down at the small kitchen table with a clatter that suggested irritation about something unrelated to the bus schedule entirely. "You look happy," she said, finally studying her daughter across the table with an expression that managed to make the observation sound almost accusatory. "You've looked happy for 2 weeks now. What's going on?" Olivia felt her cheeks warm slightly, and she busied herself with her spoon to avoid her mother's gaze. "Nothing's going on. I got a new job, remember, logistics coordinator. I start tomorrow." "I remember." Diane's tone softened only slightly. "That's good news, Olivia. Real good news. Your father would have been proud." A shadow crossed her face at the mention of him, quickly folded away the same practiced motion Olivia had inherited without realizing it. "But that's not the kind of happy I'm talking about, and you know it." Olivia set down her spoon. There was no point pretending with her mother. Diane Hendricks had built an entire second career over the years out of noticing exactly the things her daughter hoped to keep quiet. "There's someone," Olivia admitted finally. "I don't really know how to explain it yet. It's new." "Someone." Diane's eyebrows lifted. "Does someone have a name, a job, a place to live that isn't a shelter?" The specificity of the last question startled Olivia enough that she looked up sharply. "Why would you ask that?" "Because Deb Whitmore saw you at that soup kitchen on Franklin 2 weeks running, sitting with some man who looked like he hadn't eaten a hot meal in a month." Diane's voice climbed sharp now, the particular sharpness of fear dressed up as anger. "Olivia, tell me you are not seriously involved with a homeless man." "His name is West," Olivia said, steadier than she felt, "and he is a good person, Mom. A genuinely good person. You don't know him. I don't need to know him. I know what happens to women who fall for men with nothing to offer them." Diane's hands trembled slightly as she pushed her bowl aside, no longer interested in her own dinner. "I loved a man with nothing once, Olivia. I loved him more than I've ever loved anything in my whole life, and I buried him with debts I'm still paying off 20 years later. I watched you grow up in a house where we counted every dollar twice before we spent it, where I worked 2 jobs just so you'd have shoes that fit. I will not watch you walk into that same life with open eyes." The room went quiet except for the low murmur of the television in the next room. Olivia stared at her mother, seeing not for the first time the particular exhaustion that lived permanently behind Diane's eyes. Not simple bitterness, but grief that had calcified over decades into something that looked like bitterness, because it was easier to carry that way. "I'm not you, Mom," Olivia said gently. "And West isn't Dad. I'm not asking you to relive anything. I'm just asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing. You're 26 years old and you found this man collapsed on a street corner." Diane's voice cracked slightly, the anger giving way just for a moment to something roar underneath it. "I'm not trying to hurt you, baby. I'm trying to save you 10 years of the life I lived. Please." Olivia reached across the table and took her mother's hand, feeling the tremor still running through it. "I hear you," she said softly. "I do. But I need you to hear me too. This isn't the same story. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm just asking you not to fight me on it." Diane pulled her hand back slowly, not unkindly, and stood to clear the table, her back to her daughter for a long moment before she spoke again. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said, finally, her voice carefully controlled now, the earlier crack sealed back over. "Trent Callahan. Sharon from church introduced us. He's her nephew. Does something in commercial real estate. Drives a car nicer than anything on this whole block. He's been asking about you since he saw your picture at the church potluck last month. Mom, just meet him. One dinner. That's all I'm asking." Diane turned back to face her, and for a moment the sharpness dissolved entirely into something closer to pleading. "I am not trying to control your life, Olivia. I am trying to give you a door that leads somewhere safe, so that if this thing with Wes doesn't work out, and I pray to God it works out better than I fear it will, you'll have somewhere solid to land." Olivia sat with the request for a long moment, torn between the loyalty she felt toward a man she barely knew the last name of, and the exhausted protective love radiating off her mother across a kitchen table that had witnessed 20 years of both of their hardest conversations. "One dinner," she said, finally reluctantly. "That's all. And Mom, I need you to actually give West a chance too. When the time comes." Diane didn't answer that directly, busying herself instead with the dishes, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested the promise had not been fully accepted. 3 nights later, Olivia sat across from Trent Callahan at a steakhouse downtown, the kind of restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than the actual menu, and found herself, despite every instinct telling her to stay, guarded faintly, unsettled by how easily the evening seemed, engineered to impress her. Trent was handsome in an obvious, well-groomed way, tailored suit, a watch that caught the light every time he gestured, a smile that appeared exactly on cue whenever the conversation called for warmth. He asked thoughtful questions about her new job. He complimented her without being crude about it. He picked up the check with a practiced casualness that suggested he'd done this many times before, for many different women in many different restaurants exactly like this one. And yet something about him, some quality Olivia couldn't quite name, a smoothness that felt rehearsed rather than natural, left her thinking on the walk to the bus stop afterward, not of Trent Callahan's expensive watch or easy smile, but of a man in a threadbare coat who had once told her, with his voice breaking slightly, that she was the first person in longer than he could remember, who'd made him feel like being cared for wasn't something he had to earn first. She pulled out her phone as she waited for the bus, scrolling to a name saved simply as West, and typed a message before she could second-guess herself. "Dinner with a friend of my mom's tonight. Nothing important. Wish you were here instead." She had no way of knowing, sending it, that across the city in a black car parked half a block from a soup kitchen on Franklin Avenue, a man was photographing Weston Kane through a long lens, and that the message she'd just sent would arrive in Trent Callahan's own phone 40 minutes later, forwarded quietly by the very man taking those photographs as a courtesy between men working for the same employer. The invitation came from Olivia, not her mother, and it came with a note of nervousness in her voice that Weston hadn't heard from her before. "She wants to meet you, Olivia," said, standing on the sidewalk outside the soup kitchen, her breath fogging in the cold evening air. "I told her about you, not everything, but enough. She said if you're going to keep showing up in my life, she wants to see your face at her table at least once." Weston felt the request land with a complicated weight. Every instinct, honed over 3 weeks of careful concealment, told him this was dangerous. A mother's kitchen table was not a place a man could hide behind vague half-truths forever. But he had also spent enough nights now imagining a version of his life that included Olivia Hendricks fully honestly, without the wall of a false name between them, that he found himself agreeing before he'd fully weighed the risk. "Tell her I'd be honored," he said, and meant it. Diane Hendricks's house sat on a narrow street in northeast Minneapolis, its porch light burning yellow against the early dark when Weston arrived, 2 evenings later, wearing the least worn of his 3 shirts, his hair combed as best he could manage without a proper mirror. Olivia met him at the door, squeezing his hand once before leading him inside, a silent reassurance that did little to steady the nervous hammer of his heart. Diane was exactly as guarded as Olivia had warned him she might be, a thin, sharp-eyed woman who studied Weston across the dinner table, with the particular scrutiny of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to distrust easy charm. She asked careful, pointed questions. Where was he from? What had he done before he found himself, as she put it, without much softness in his current circumstances? Weston answered as honestly as he could within the boundaries of the lie. He was still maintaining careful, deliberate watching her face for any sign of the warmth Olivia clearly hoped he'd earn. It was over coffee near the end of the meal that the conversation shifted into territory neither Weston nor Olivia had anticipated. "You remind me a little of my husband," Diane said, suddenly staring into her cup rather than at Weston, her voice gone quieter, rougher around the edges. "Not in looks. In the way you don't talk about yourself much." He was like that too. Kept things close. Mom, Olivia said gently, a warning note in her voice, but Diane waved it off. Let me talk, Olivia. It's been a long time since I have about this. She looked up, and for a moment the guarded sharpness in her eyes gave way to something older and raw. A grief that had clearly never fully healed, no matter how many years had passed over it. My husband worked the production line at a milling company. Good hands, steady work, the kind of job you think is going to carry a family for 30 years if you're careful. Her hand tightened slightly around her cup. 15 years ago, there was an accident on the floor. A conveyor system malfunction should never have happened if the equipment had been properly maintained the way it was supposed to be. He didn't make it home that night. Weston felt something cold settle low in his stomach, an instinct sharpening before his conscious mind had even caught up to why. The company called it an isolated incident, Diane went on, her voice flattening into the practiced neutrality of a story told so many times it had worn smooth like a stone handled for years. Paid out the legal minimum, had their lawyers make sure the paperwork closed the case fast and quiet. No further inquiry. No public statement. I spent 2 years trying to get anyone to admit the machinery had been flagged for maintenance months before and never fixed because it was cheaper to run it into the ground than replace it. Nobody would listen to a widow with a young daughter and no money for real lawyers. She let out a short, humorless breath. Kane Milling Company. That was the name on the paycheck. I have hated that name for 15 years. The words hit Weston like a physical blow the air, leaving his lungs in a silent rush he fought desperately to keep from showing on his face. Across the table, Olivia's expression had gone still, watching her mother with the particular helplessness of someone who had heard this story before and never known how to make it easier to bear. Kane Milling. His father's company. His company. Somewhere in the vast machinery of an empire he had inherited and expanded, and if he was honest with himself, never audited closely enough. A man had died because a piece of equipment was allowed to run past the point of safety, and the company had spent money making sure the truth never surfaced, instead of spending it on the maintenance that would have saved his life. Weston's voice came out unsteady, and he had to stop, force air back into his chest before he could continue. I'm so sorry. That's an unimaginable thing to carry. It is what it is. Diane shrugged, the gesture carrying the exhausted resignation of someone who had made peace long ago, with a wound that would never fully close. I don't tell people much anymore. Doesn't do any good dredging it up. But you asked where I get my caution from in a roundabout way, sitting there being so careful about your own past. She looked at him with something that was almost but not quite an apology. That's where it comes from. I learned the hard way that powerful people don't answer for what they break. They just move on to the next quarter's numbers. Weston sat frozen, his hands folded so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white, a war raging silently behind his carefully composed expression. Every part of him wanted to speak, to confess right there at the table that the name she hated with such quiet, calcified grief was his own name, that he was the chairman of the very company that had cost her the man she loved, that he could, this very night, reopen the case, expose the cover-up, make right what 15 years of silence had left broken. The words rose in his throat and lodged there useless because he understood with a clarity that felt like drowning, that the moment he spoke his real name in this kitchen, he would lose something he had only just begun to believe he might be allowed to keep. You okay? Olivia asked quietly, noticing the color drained from his face, her hand finding his under the table. Yeah, he managed, though the word came out hollow. Just, it's a hard story to hear. I'm sorry your family went through that. Diane studied him for a moment longer, something in her expression softening slightly, mistaking his visible distress for simple empathy rather than the private earthquake it actually was. You've got a kind face, she said finally, almost grudgingly. I'll give you that much. Olivia could do worse. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Weston could barely account for afterward polite conversation. A second cup of coffee. He didn't taste Olivia, walking him to the door with a small, hopeful smile that told him the dinner had gone, by her measure, well. He kissed her goodnight on the porch, gentle and lingering, and walked away into the cold with his chest cracked open by a grief that wasn't even his to carry, and yet had somehow in the space of one dinner become the heaviest thing he'd carried in 9 years. 2 blocks from Diane's house, he stopped walking entirely, leaning against a brick wall in the dark, and allowed himself finally to break silent, shaking his hand pressed hard against his mouth to keep the sound from escaping into the empty street. He thought of his father, a man who had preached fairness and dignity at every dinner table Weston could remember, who would have been horrified genuinely deeply horrified to learn that his company's negligence had taken a husband and father from a family that never fully recovered. He thought of Olivia's small, hand-stitched blanket, of Diane's tired, guarded eyes, of an entire family shaped by a grief that traced directly back to a boardroom he had inherited, and never once questioned closely enough. He pulled out his phone with unsteady hands and dialed Charlie's number, not caring that it was nearly 11 at night. "I need everything on file about a workplace accident 15 years ago," Weston said, the moment Charlie picked up his voice, raw, urgent, barely holding together. "A man named Hendricks. Production floor. A conveyor malfunction. I need the truth, Charlie, all of it tonight, no matter how bad it is." There was a pause on the other end of the line, Charlie's voice careful, alarmed. "West, what happened?" "I just found out," Weston said quietly, staring up at a sky heavy with the promise of more snow, "that the company I run may have destroyed the life of the woman I'm falling in love with, and I have no idea yet how I'm supposed to live with that." Charlie Donovan did not sleep that night. By the time the first gray light crept over the Mississippi, he had already pulled every archived personnel file, safety inspection record, and legal settlement connected to a workplace fatality 15 years old, spreading printouts across the conference table on the 42nd floor like a man, laying out the pieces of a crime scene, which in every meaningful sense was exactly what he was doing. The name on the file matched exactly what Weston had given him over the phone the night before: Robert Hendricks, age 41, production floor supervisor, killed instantly when a conveyor system malfunctioned during a night shift 15 years earlier. The official report filed by Kane Milling's legal department at the time described the incident as an unforeseeable mechanical failure. Charlie read that sentence 4 times before he found what he'd been dreading: a maintenance log, buried 3 folders deep, showing that the exact system in question had been flagged for replacement 8 months before the accident, and that the replacement had been repeatedly delayed by a cost-cutting directive issued from the replacement 8 months plant's regional management office. The signature authorizing that delay belonged to a name Charlie recognized instantly, a name that made his stomach turn even before he'd finished reading it: Derek Kane. By the time Weston arrived at the office that morning, his first time back inside the building in nearly a month, slipping in through a service entrance in borrowed clothes so the front desk wouldn't recognize the disheveled man who used to run the place, Charlie was waiting for him with the folder already open on the table, his face gray with exhaustion and something closer to grief. "He wasn't just careless with the company's future," Charlie said quietly without preamble, sliding the maintenance log across the table. "He killed a man to protect a budget line. Robert Hendricks died because Derek delayed a repair that would have cost less than what he spends on a single dinner now." Weston stood very still, staring down at the page, at a dead man's name typed in the same cold, bureaucratic font as every other line item in the report. He thought of Diane Hendricks's tired, guarded eyes across her kitchen table, of the particular exhaustion in her voice when she'd said, "I spent 2 years trying to get someone to admit the truth and nobody would listen to it. Vidov." He thought of Olivia, 26 years old now, who would have been 11 when her father didn't come home, old enough to remember him clearly, old enough to have carried the shape of that loss through every year since. "I want everything," Weston said finally, his voice low and controlled in a way that Charlie recognized as the sound of a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. "Every document, every signature. I want to know exactly how far this goes, and I want it done quietly, no leaks, nothing that reaches Derek before I decide how to handle him." "What are you going to do?" Charlie asked carefully. Weston was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gray river below, the same river that ran 2 miles from a soup kitchen, where the night before he had eaten chicken and rice out of a paper bowl beside a woman who had no idea the man across from her held in his own hands the truth about her father's death. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I know I can't walk into her mother's kitchen and tell her the man she's been mourning for 15 years was failed by a decision my own cousin made to save money. Not yet. Not without a plan that actually makes it right, instead of just making myself feel less guilty for knowing. And Olivia?" The question landed harder than Charlie probably intended, and Weston closed his eyes, briefly pressing the heel of his hand against them. "She doesn't know any of this connects to me. She thinks West is a man with nothing, not the chairman of the company that let her father die." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Every day I don't tell her feels like a smaller version of the same lie the company told her mother 15 years ago. Withholding the truth because it's inconvenient. I promised myself I'd never be a man who did that, and here I am doing exactly that every single night I walk away from her, without saying my real name." Charlie set a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder, the same gesture that had passed between them a dozen times over 2 decades of friendship, though it carried more weight now than it ever had before. "You're not the same as Derek," he said firmly. "You didn't cause this. You're trying to fix it. That matters, West. It has to. Does it?" Weston's voice was hoarse. "Or does it just mean I'm better at hiding what I've done than he was?" Neither of them had an easy answer for that, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that the morning sun climbed fully over the skyline outside, indifferent to the reckoning happening in the quiet room 42 floors above the street. It was Charlie who finally spoke again, his tone shifting into something more practical, the accountant in him, instinctively reaching for a plan where grief alone offered none. "Here's what we can do," he said. "Quietly through the company foundation, not attached to your name, not attached to Kane Milling, directly routed through a private trust instead. We reopen a compensation fund for the Hendricks family, backdated with interest for every year the original settlement should have covered and didn't. We fund it generously enough that money stops being something Diane Hendricks has to think about for the rest of her life." And separately, he added more carefully, "Now we build the paper trail on Derek, quietly, patiently, until it's airtight enough that when this finally comes out, and it will come out, West's secrets like this don't stay buried forever. There's nowhere left for him to hide." Weston nodded slowly, something in his shoulders settling not into peace exactly, but into the particular steadiness of a man who finally has a direction to walk in, even through wreckage. "Start the trust today," he said. "I don't care what it costs. And Charlie," he paused, meeting his friend's eyes directly, "thank you for finding this, for not letting me keep living comfortably inside a story that was never true." "That's what I'm here for," Charlie said simply. "It's what I've always been here for." Weston left the building the way he'd come in, through the service entrance, back into borrowed clothes and a name that wasn't his. And as he walked the long distance back toward Lyndale Avenue, toward a laundromat, a small apartment, with a hand-stitched blanket, a woman who thought she'd fallen for a man with nothing he carried inside him, a weight far heavier than any he'd known in 3 weeks of hunger and cold nights. It was not the weight of poverty. It was the weight of knowing that the truth, when it finally surfaced, might cost him the one thing that had made the last month bearable at all. That evening he found Olivia waiting for him outside the soup kitchen, her face brightening the moment she saw him, entirely unaware of the storm quietly gathering behind his eyes. "You look tired," she said, studying his face with the same careful attentiveness she always brought to him. "Rough day." "Something like that," he admitted, managing a small, exhausted smile. "But it's better now that I'm here." She slipped her hand into his without hesitation, and Weston held on tighter than he meant to, grateful, guilty, and quietly terrified in equal measure. A man walking beside the daughter of someone his own family had failed, still not brave enough not yet to tell her the truth that might unmake everything gentle they had built between them. Olivia's first 2 weeks at Meridian Freight Solutions passed in the particular blur of a person learning for the first time in years what it felt like to be trusted with real responsibility. She came home each evening, slightly dazed, her feet aching from a full day in dress shoes she wasn't used to, but with a lightness in her voice that hadn't been there before. Talk of shipping manifests and supply chains, and the manager who'd told her at the end of her second week that she had a natural instinct for logistics most people took months to develop. Weston listened to every detail of it with an attentiveness that felt to him like the least he could offer a woman whose father's death he now carried as a private, unspoken debt. He never mentioned the trust Charlie had quietly established for her family, routed through a private foundation with no visible connection to Kane Milling. He never mentioned Derek's name, or the maintenance logs, or the growing case file Charlie was building in a locked drawer 42 floors above the city. He simply sat with her in the evenings on a bench near the river, when the weather allowed it, and let her talk, grateful for every ordinary detail of her day that gave him a few hours of distance from the extraordinary weight of what he now knew. It was on one of those evenings, the air sharp, but the wind finally calm, that Olivia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope, holding it out to him with both hands, before she could talk herself out of it. "I want you to have this," she said. Weston looked down at the envelope, confused, and opened it carefully. Inside was cash, not a large sum by any measure he was used to thinking in, but substantial, by any measure that mattered to a woman who worked double shifts at a laundromat to make rent. $2,000 in worn 20s and 50s, clearly saved one careful deposit at a time. "Olivia," his voice caught something in his chest, tightening painfully. "I can't take this." "You can, and you're going to." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly around the empty envelope she still held. "That's 3 years of savings, West. Every spare dollar I could set aside after rent and groceries. I always told myself it was for something important, a car that actually starts in winter. Maybe someday a place with a real bedroom instead of a studio. But every time I thought about what I actually wanted to spend it on, I kept thinking about you. You don't owe me anything." Weston's voice had gone rough, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "You've already given me more than you know. I can't take the last of what you have. You're not taking it. I'm giving it." She reached out, closing his hand gently around the envelope with both of hers. "You told me once that you needed a chance to start over, a real one, not just surviving day to day. I believe in you, West. I don't know everything about your past, and I've stopped needing to know all of it before I decide you're worth believing in. This is me telling you that. With the only thing I actually have to give." Weston stood very still, staring down at the envelope in his hands, and felt something inside him break open with a violence that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a grief and gratitude. So tangled together he could no longer separate them. He thought of every zero on every account he owned, of a fortune so large it had long ago stopped feeling real even to him, of boardrooms where men negotiated over sums larger than Olivia's entire life savings, without so much as raising their voices. And here was a woman handing him 3 years of careful sacrifice with both hands, asking for nothing in return except the chance to believe he was worth it. "I don't deserve this," he said, and the words came out cracked, half swallowed. "That's not how kindness works," Olivia said, softly reaching up to touch his face, her thumb brushing gently along his jaw, where days of exhaustion and grief had etched lines that hadn't been there a month ago. "You don't earn it first. You just receive it, and you carry it forward. My dad used to say that. Whenever he'd help someone, a neighbor short on rent, a coworker who needed a jump start on a cold morning, he'd say the same thing every time. Good people are rewarded. Maybe not today, but it comes back." The mention of her father landed in Weston's chest like a struck bell, the guilt and grief he'd been carrying since the dinner at Diane's kitchen table rising up all over again, sharper now for the tenderness of the moment. Interrupted. He thought of the trust fund sitting quietly in a private account waiting for the right moment to reach a family it could never fully repay. He thought of Derek's signature on a maintenance delay order of a conveyor system left unrepaired to save a line item, of a man named Robert Hendricks, who would never know that his daughter had grown into a woman capable of this kind of unguarded generosity. "Your father sounds like he was an extraordinary man," Weston said quietly, meaning it with an intensity Olivia couldn't fully understand the source of. He was. Her eyes softened, grief and warmth mingling in a way that had become familiar to Weston over the past weeks. "I think about him more than I let on, especially lately." She studied Weston's face for a long moment, something searching in her expression. "You remind me of him sometimes. The way you listen. The way you never seem to think you deserve good things even when you clearly do." Weston pulled her into an embrace before she could see the tears he could no longer hold back, pressing his face against her hair, holding her the way a man holds something he is terrified of losing and doesn't yet know how to protect properly. He thought of every lie still standing unspoken between them, his name, his fortune, the very company responsible for the debt he now silently, desperately wanted to repay, and felt for the first time since this entire experiment began. The true cost of the deception weighing on him not as a strategic risk but as a moral one. "I promise you," he said against her hair, his voice thick, "whatever happens, whatever you learn about me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worth what you just gave me tonight." Olivia pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a small, uncertain smile, sensing the weight in his words without fully understanding its source. "That's a big promise for $2,000, she said softly, trying to lighten the moment. "It's not about the money," Weston said, meaning it more than she could know. It never was. Above them, the last of the evening light faded fully into dark street lamps, flickering on one by one down the length of the block, and neither of them noticed in the tenderness of the moment. A black car parked at the far corner, its driver, watching through a long lens, already composing the message he would send to Derek Kane within the hour. Target confirmed, emotionally compromised. Recommend accelerating the Callahan timeline before Kane regains his composure. Charlie Donovan had learned over 2 decades of friendship with Weston Kane to trust a particular feeling in his gut whenever something didn't add up, a low, persistent unease that had saved the company from at least 3 bad acquisitions and more than once saved Weston himself from people who wanted access to him for reasons that had nothing to do with friendship. That feeling had been humming steadily for 3 days now, ever since Olivia had mentioned in passing over dinner with West the name of the man her mother kept pushing her toward. Trent Callahan. Something in commercial real estate. It was such a small detail that Weston had barely registered it at the time. But Charlie, sitting at his desk on the 42nd floor with a folder of Derek Kane's financial records spread in front of him, had felt the name catch in his memory like a hook snagging fabric, and he had spent the better part of 3 nights afterward pulling on that thread until it finally quietly came undone. He found Weston at the small apartment Charlie had arranged for him near the river. Not luxurious, but warm, clean, a modest interim shelter. Weston had reluctantly agreed to use once the temperatures dropped low enough to be genuinely dangerous so long as it stayed a secret from Olivia. Charlie let himself in without knocking a folder tucked under his arm, his face carrying an expression Weston had learned over the years to brace himself for. "We need to talk about Trent Callahan," Charlie said, setting the folder down on the small kitchen table. Weston looked up from the window. He'd been staring out of something in his posture, tensing immediately. Olivia's mother's friend. The one she had dinner with. The one, Charlie said grimly, who works for a shell development firm called North Star Commercial Holdings, which, if you trace the ownership through 2 offshore entities and a very carefully obscured trust. He opened the folder, laying out a chain of documents he'd spent 3 sleepless nights assembling. "Belongs to Derek." The silence that followed was absolute. Weston stared down at the paperwork, at names and account numbers that connected with damning clarity. A man his cousin had quietly funded to a real estate firm that existed largely on paper, employing exactly one visible person, Trent Callahan. "He's not courting Olivia because he's interested in her," Charlie said quietly, watching the realization land on his friend's face in real time. "He's courting her because Derek told him to. Somewhere along the way, Derek figured out that you'd formed an attachment to a woman named Olivia Hendricks, and instead of coming after you directly, which would be traceable, which would raise questions, he's using her. Getting close to her, isolating her from you, positioning himself as the safer, wealthier, more respectable choice her mother already wants for her. If it works, you lose her without Derek ever having to lift a finger against you personally. And if it doesn't work fast enough, he uses her as leverage." Weston's voice had gone hollow ice, settling through his chest as the full shape of the plan revealed itself. "To draw me out. To make me choose between staying hidden and protecting her. That's my read on it, yes." Charlie's jaw was tight. "And there's something else." He pulled another page from the folder, sliding it across the table. "The message intercepted from the car outside your apartment 2 nights ago, the one Priya flagged. It referenced accelerating the Callahan timeline. I think Derek's getting impatient. I think he's planning to push Trent towards something more permanent with Olivia faster than he originally intended. Specifically because he's noticed how attached you've become to her." Weston sat down heavily, the weight of it pressing down on him with a force that felt for a moment like it might genuinely crush the air out of his lungs. He thought of Olivia's face lighting up over a job offer, her mother's guarded warmth loosening slightly across a dinner table, the small worn envelope of savings she had pressed into his hands with both of hers only nights before. All of it now recontextualized inside a much larger, older machine that had been quietly turning since before he'd even collapsed in the snow outside her apartment. "How long have they been watching her?" he asked, his voice tight with a fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Since the first week you were seen near her block, I'd guess. Maybe longer." Charlie hesitated, then added more gently. "Weston, I know how badly you want to march over to her apartment tonight and tell her everything. But if we move too fast, if Derek realizes we know about Trent, he could panic and do something far more dangerous than a slow social maneuver. We need to be careful. Strategic. The way we're being careful with Diane's case." "I'm tired of being careful," Weston said, his voice cracking raw with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. "Every day I stay silent. Someone I care about gets pulled further into danger because of my family's mess. My father, Diane, now Olivia. When does careful stop being wise and start being cowardice?" Charlie sat down across from him, his expression softening into something more brotherly than professional. "It stops being wise the moment protecting her requires you to act. And I think that moment is close, West. But we do it right. We build the case against Derek airtight, the accident, the shell company's Trent's real employer, so that when you finally step back into your own name, it isn't just a confession of a hidden identity. It's the moment the whole house of cards collapses on the man who spent 9 years hiding behind it." Weston pressed his palms against his eyes, breathing hard, fighting the urge to simply run to Olivia's apartment that instant and tell her everything: his name, his fortune, her father's death, the danger circling closer with every day. He stayed silent. But beneath the urgency, he recognized the wisdom in Charlie's caution. The same steady, careful mind that had caught the accident report that had traced Trent Callahan back to a shell company most people would never have thought to. "Question. How much time do we have?" he asked finally. "I don't know," Charlie admitted. "Days, maybe. Not weeks." If Derek is accelerating the timeline, he's planning to push Trent into some kind of formal commitment with Olivia soon, engagement, maybe faster than that if he's desperate enough to skip the courtship entirely and lean on Diane's approval instead. He met Weston's eyes steadily. We need to move faster than they are. Starting tomorrow. Weston nodded slowly, something hardening behind his grief. Not just the resolve to protect the truth any longer, but the resolve to protect Olivia whatever it cost him. Whatever secrets had to come out sooner than he'd planned. Then let's move, he said. Whatever it takes. I'm done letting Derek Kane decide who gets hurt next. Outside the small apartment window, the first heavy snow of the week began falling over the city, blanketing the streets in a silence that felt to Weston like the deep and dangerous quiet before something enormous finally broke loose. Brianna Hendricks had always lived in her older sister's shadow, though she would never have described it that way herself, not even in the privacy of her own head. 2 years younger, 3 inches shorter, and by her own quiet, corrosive accounting perpetually, 1 step behind Olivia in every measure that seemed to matter: the better grades, the steadier temperament, the easy way people gravitated toward Olivia's warmth without her ever appearing to try for it. Brianna had spent most of her 24 years telling herself she didn't care. She had gotten very good at the lie. She sat on the edge of Olivia's bed on a gray Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly there to borrow a sweater while her sister showered in the next room, and stared at the phone left charging on the nightstand, its screen lit with a string of messages from a contact, saved simply as West, each one warmer than the last, each one a small window into a happiness. Brianna had watched bloom across her sister's face for weeks now, with a feeling she refused to name as jealousy, even as it curdled steadily in her chest. Thinking about you today. Hope the new job's treating you well. Can't stop replaying dinner last night. Thank you for trusting me with your mom. Whatever happens, I need you to know you've changed everything for me. Brianna read each one twice, her jaw tightening, thinking of her own string of failed relationships, of a mother who had spent 20 years praising Olivia's steadiness, while gently, persistently worrying aloud about Brianna's choices, her spending her tendency to quit jobs before they quit her. She thought of Trent Callahan, handsome, composed, driving a car that cost more than Brianna's entire annual salary, sitting at Diane's kitchen table 2 weeks ago, his attention politely, unmistakably fixed on Olivia the entire evening, as it always was, as everyone's attention always was. She doesn't even want him, Brianna thought bitterly, staring at the glowing screen. She's got the homeless guy hanging around and a millionaire waiting in line, and she still can't decide because everything just falls into her lap either way. The shower shut off in the next room. Brianna had maybe 90 seconds before Olivia emerged, toweling her hair, oblivious, as always, to the storm quietly gathering 3 feet away from her charging phone. Brianna's hand moved before her conscience could fully weigh in, closing around the phone, turning it over once in her palm, not deciding, not really, just testing the weight of a decision she hadn't consciously made yet. She dropped it. Not violently, just carelessly, deliberately letting it slip from her fingers onto the hardwood floor at an angle calculated in some small, dark corner of her mind to do exactly the damage it did, the screen splintering into a spider's web of cracks, the phone's display flickering once and going dark. "Oh, Liv, I'm so sorry," Brianna said, already rehearsing the apology, as Olivia stepped back into the room, towel-wrapped hair dripping onto her shoulders. "It slipped right out of my hand. I don't know what happened. I was just moving your charger and it's okay." Olivia crouched to retrieve it, turning the shattered screen over in her hands with a wince, though her voice carried more resignation than anger. "It's fine, Bri. Accidents happen. I'll take it in tomorrow, see if they can save anything off it." Brianna nodded, guilt already twisting sour and uncomfortable in her stomach, though not uncomfortable enough to admit what she'd actually done. She told herself walking home later that evening that it truly had been an accident, that the deliberate part of it, the small, vicious satisfaction she'd felt watching the screen go dark, had been nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence of timing. She did not examine the lie closely enough to notice how poorly it held together. 3 days passed before Olivia managed an appointment at the phone repair shop. 3 days during which every message Weston sent arrived and vanished into a dead screen. Unread, unanswered, the silence on the other end, stretching longer than it had at any point since the night she'd carried him in from the snow. Weston felt that silence like a physical thing. He stood outside the soup kitchen on Franklin Avenue for 3 consecutive evenings, watching the door, watching the street, a knot of dread tightening in his chest with every hour that passed without her. He told himself there were 100 ordinary explanations: a double shift, a family emergency, simple exhaustion. But every ordinary explanation sat uneasily against the shadow of Charlie's warning, against a shell company traced back to Derek Kane, against the growing certainty that whatever machinery had been set in motion around Olivia was accelerating exactly as Charlie had feared. Nothing Charlie confirmed when Weston finally called him on the third night standing alone in the cold outside her apartment building, staring up at a dark window. No unusual activity flagged near her block. No sign of Trent making a move yet as far as surveillance can tell. It's possible it really is nothing, Weston. People lose touch for ordinary reasons all the time. It doesn't feel ordinary, Weston said quietly, his breath fogging in the streetlight. Nothing about the last 3 weeks has felt ordinary, Charlie. I can't shake the feeling that something's closing in and I don't know from which direction. There was a pause on the line, and when Charlie spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, careful and reluctant, the tone of a man about to hand over information he'd been sitting on for reasons he wasn't yet ready to fully explain. There's something else, Charlie said slowly. Something I found while I was digging into Derek's financials, trying to trace how deep the Callahan connection runs. I wasn't going to bring it to you yet. I wanted to be certain first, because if I'm wrong about this, it's the kind of thing that could break something in you that never fully heals back the right way. Weston's stomach dropped, some old and terrible instinct rising in him before Charlie had said another word. Tell me. There's a name on one of the trust accounts funding Trent's shell company, Charlie said, his voice unusually careful, unusually gentle. A beneficiary listed on a related family trust dormant for over a decade reactivated 8 months ago, around the same time Derek started tracking your movements more aggressively. I ran it through every database I have access to, cross-referenced it 3 separate ways, because I genuinely didn't want to believe what it was telling me. He exhaled slowly. Weston, I need you to sit down before I say the rest of this. Weston's hand tightened around the phone, his heart hammering with a dread that felt in some deep and terrible way like it had been waiting his entire adult life for exactly this call. Just say it, Charlie. The name on the account, Charlie said quietly, is Margaret Kane. The name landed in the cold night air like a stone dropped into still water, and Weston felt the ground beneath him tilt the way it had the night he'd collapsed in the snow, the world narrowing suddenly to a single unbearable point. That's not possible, Weston said, his voice barely above a whisper. My mother is dead, Charlie. She's been dead for 20 years. I know that's what you were always told, Charlie said gently, the words carrying a weight he clearly wished he didn't have to deliver. I found a death certificate too, filed the year you turned 9. But Weston, the account activity on this trust is current. Someone accessed it 4 days ago, and whoever that was, they used a signature that matches stroke for stroke 3, surviving samples of your mother's handwriting still on file from before she disappeared. Weston stood frozen on the dark sidewalk, snow beginning to fall again around him, soft and silent, and utterly indifferent to the ground opening beneath his feet, as 20 years of grief he had believed settled and buried came suddenly, violently back to life. The invitation arrived at Diane Hendrix's house on a Tuesday, cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering, the kind of formal announcement that made Diane's hands shake slightly, with an emotion she couldn't quite name, as she read it aloud at the kitchen table. Mr. Trent Callahan and Miss Olivia Hendrix request the honor of your presence at their wedding. This is happening too fast, Olivia said, staring at the card as though it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Her phone repaired now, finally, after nearly a week of silence. She still hadn't been able to fully explain to Weston, who had grown quieter and more distant with every passing day of it. Sat dark on the table beside her, no messages from him in almost 72 hours. Mom, I haven't even said yes to him properly. He proposed 2 days ago. And you're already sending out invitations. He asked me first, Diane admitted, not entirely apologetic about it. He wanted to do it right, came to me, asked my blessing before he even got down on one knee for you. That's a man who understands respect, Olivia. That's a man who isn't going to leave you standing at a soup kitchen wondering if he's going to show up tonight. The comment landed with more cruelty than her mother probably intended, and Olivia flinched, thinking of the silence stretching now between her and West, a silence she had no way to explain because she genuinely didn't understand it. Herself. She had texted him the moment her phone was repaired. She had called twice, both times reaching only voicemail. It was as though the man she had carried in from the snow had simply vanished back into it. And every day that passed without word from him made her mother's insistence on Trent feel less like pressure and more terrifyingly like reason. I need time, Olivia said quietly. You don't have time, baby. Trent's already told his family the date. 2 weeks. I know it feels fast, but sometimes the right thing feels fast because you've spent so long convincing yourself you don't deserve it to be easy. Diane reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand with a tenderness that made refusal feel almost impossible. I just want you settled, Olivia. Safe. I've watched you struggle for years. Let me watch you not struggle for once. before I'm too old to enjoy seeing it." Olivia said nothing further, the protest dying in her throat under the weight of her mother's hope under the crushing silence from a phone that refused to light up with the one name she actually wanted to see. What Olivia did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the silence itself had been manufactured with surgical precision. Trent Callahan's employer had ensured through a contact inside the phone repair shop that the technician handling Olivia's cracked screen quietly installed a call-blocking filter on a single contact before returning the device, routing every call and message from West straight to a dead server instead of her inbox. It was a small, invisible cruelty, the kind that left no fingerprints, and it had worked exactly as Derek Kane intended, isolating Olivia at precisely the moment she most needed to hear a familiar voice telling her not to be afraid. Weston, unaware of the sabotage, had spent the week reeling from a different devastation, entirely the discovery that his mother, Margaret Kane, was alive and had apparently been working in concert with Derek for months. Charlie had confirmed it fully by the 5th day. Margaret had left 20 years ago, not out of simple abandonment as Weston had always believed, but after losing a bitter internal fight over her share of the company following her divorce from Frank Kane, a fight she had never forgiven, a wound she had nursed in silence for 2 decades, until Derek found her and offered her a way to finally reclaim what she believed she was owed. The double blow, his mother's betrayal layered directly on top of the growing danger circling Olivia, had left Weston moving through the days like a man underwater, and it was only when Charlie burst into his small apartment near the river, breathless, his cane striking the floor with unusual urgency, that he surfaced fully back into the present crisis. "She's getting married," Charlie said, holding up his phone a photograph of the wedding invitation captured through a contact at Diane's church. 2 weeks from now. Olivia and Trent Callahan. "Weston, if we don't move now, we lose our window entirely." Weston stared at the photograph, and something inside him, grief, fear, 20 years of buried anger, finally converged into a single clarifying resolve. "Then we don't wait 2 weeks, he said. "We move today." The wedding in the end happened faster than even Charlie's warning had suggested. Trent, under pressure from Derek to close the arrangement before Weston could interfere, pushed Diane and Olivia toward an abbreviated ceremony just 4 days later, held at a modest banquet hall on the north side of Prom. The city decorated hastily but expensively, the kind of wedding that photographed beautifully and concealed beneath its polish an urgency no one but the groom fully understood. Olivia stood in the small dressing room adjoining the hall an hour before the ceremony, staring at her reflection in a borrowed white dress, feeling less like a bride and more like a woman watching someone else's life happen to her from a slight distance. "You look beautiful," Brianna said from the doorway, her voice carrying an unfamiliar tremor. Guilt she still hadn't found the courage to confess sitting heavy and unspoken behind her eyes. "I don't feel like myself," Olivia admitted, quietly adjusting a pin in her hair with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. "I keep thinking I should feel happy. Everyone keeps telling me how lucky I am." "Are you happy?" Brianna asked, and something in her tone made Olivia look up sharply, catching for the first time a flicker of genuine concern beneath her sister's usual careful distance. Olivia opened her mouth to answer, and found standing there in a dress that wasn't the one she'd have chosen for herself in a marriage that had assembled itself around her faster than she could examine any of it closely, that she didn't have an honest answer to give. Outside, 3 blocks away, a car pulled up sharply to the curb, and Weston Kane stepped out into the cold in the finest suit Charlie had managed to have tailored for him in 4 days' notice. The first time in nearly 2 months he dressed as the man he actually was, rather than the man he'd pretended to be. "Sir, you can't go in there," a security guard said at the hall's entrance, stepping into his path unmoved by Weston's urgency or his unfamiliar face. "Wedding's private. Family and invited guests only. I need to see Olivia Hendricks." Weston said, his voice steady, despite the frantic pounding of his heart. "Please, it's urgent." "Not on the list, not going in." The guard's tone left no room for negotiation, and behind him through the hall's frosted glass doors Weston could make out the faint, distorted shapes of guests already gathering, the low murmur of a string quartet beginning to play. Charlie arrived a moment later, breathless, having parked and hurried across the lot as fast as his weaker leg would carry him, his cane striking the pavement in a rhythm that had grown increasingly urgent over the past 4 days. "West," he gasped, catching up. "Security's tight. Derek must have paid to have the guest list locked down. We're not getting through the front." Weston stared past the guard through the frosted glass toward the shape of a ceremony about to begin without him, toward a woman he loved, standing somewhere on the other side of that door, believing perhaps that he had simply vanished from her life, the way everyone she'd ever loved eventually seemed to. Then we find another way in Weston, said Jawset, already moving along the side of the building, scanning for a service entrance, a delivery door, any crack in the careful architecture Derek had built to keep him out. I am not losing her to a lie I never got the chance to correct. Behind him, Charlie followed as fast as his leg allowed, and somewhere inside the hall, the string quartet shifted into the opening notes of a processional march, counting down without any of them yet knowing it. The final minutes before, everything Derek Kane had spent months constructing came apart at once. The service entrance sat at the rear of the banquet hall, half hidden behind a row of catering vans, and Weston found it exactly the way he found most solutions under pressure, not through careful planning, but through sheer refusal to accept that a locked door was truly the end of the road. He pulled it open before the startled catering staff inside could object, Charlie limping in close behind him, both of them moving through a narrow hallway lined with folded linens and stacked chairs toward the muffled swell of a string quartet somewhere on the other side of the wall. Inside the main hall, Olivia stood at the head of the aisle beside her mother, the white dress heavy and unfamiliar around her, her bouquet trembling faintly in hands she couldn't quite steady. Trent Callahan waited at the altar with the easy, practiced composure of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment many times, though never once in any of those rehearsals for the reason he actually stood there. The processional reached its final measures. Diane squeezed her daughter's hand, once whispering something meant to be comforting that Olivia barely registered over the roaring in her own ears. And then, just as the officiant opened his mouth to begin, the side door at the edge of the hall burst open, and a man in an unfamiliar suit strode in with a desperation that silenced the room faster than any spoken word could have. Olivia. She turned, and for one disorienting heartbeat did not recognize him at all. The gaunt, exhausted stranger she'd carried in from the snow, replaced by a man in a tailored suit, cleanly shaven, standing with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and having them go quiet around him. And then his eyes found hers, and beneath the suit and the unfamiliar polish, she saw exactly the same man who had once told her voice break that she was the first person in years to make him feel like being cared for wasn't something he had to earn. West. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, disbelief and hope and confusion colliding all at once across her face. My name is Weston Kane, he said, his voice carrying now deliberate, unhidden, filling the stunned silence of the hall. I'm the chairman of Kane Milling Company. I've been lying to you about that for 2 months, and I am so sorry, Olivia, but I could not let you stand at that altar without knowing the truth, all of it, before you said a single vow you couldn't take back. A gasp rippled through the assembled guests, whispers breaking out like a struck match catching dry grass. Diane's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that had nothing to do with the scandal of an interrupted wedding, and everything to do with a name she had spent 15 years hating, without ever once suspecting it belonged to the gentle, quiet man who had sat at her kitchen table. Kane Milling, she said the words barely audible, her face draining of color. That's the company that let your husband die because my cousin chose to save money over a repair that would have cost less than what he spends in a week, Weston said, meeting her eyes directly, unflinching despite the enormity of what he was confessing in front of a room full of strangers. I found out 4 weeks ago, Mrs. Hendricks, at your own kitchen table, listening to you tell that story without knowing the shame belonged to my family. I've spent every day since trying to figure out how to make it right without breaking something I wasn't ready to lose. Trent Callahan, standing frozen at the altar through the first half of this unraveling, seemed to finally register the danger closing in around him, his composed expression cracking into something colder, more calculating. This is absurd, he said, his voice climbing, forced and unconvincing even to his own ears. This man breaks into a private wedding, makes wild accusations. They're not accusations. Charlie stepped forward from the doorway, breathing hard from the effort of keeping pace, but his voice carried clear and steady across the hall. Trent Callahan, employed by North Star Commercial Holdings, a shell company owned through 3 layers of offshore trusts by Derek Kane. I have the documents. Every transfer, every payment, every message coordinating your approach to this family. He held up a folder, his hand trembling slightly, though whether from exertion or fury it was impossible to say. You were never courting Olivia because you cared for her. You were sent. The color drained from Trent's face, the easy charm evaporating in an instant, replaced by something sharper, more desperate. His eyes darted toward the exits, calculating, and Weston watched the exact moment a cornered man decided that composure was no longer worth maintaining. You have no idea what you've just done, Trent said quietly, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous, the mask fully gone now. He took a step toward Weston, his hand slipping inside his jacket with a movement too controlled, too deliberate to be anything but rehearsed. What happened next unfolded in the space of a few frantic seconds. Weston, caught between shielding Olivia and confronting Trent, directly hesitated, a fraction of a second too long, and Charlie, moving faster than his weaker leg should have allowed, threw himself forward, placing his own body between Trent and his oldest friend. Just as Trent's hand cleared his jacket, the struggle that followed was brief and chaotic, a security guard rushing in from the hallway, guests screaming and scattering, Diane pulling Olivia backward with a mother's instinct even as her daughter fought to stay to see. Charlie went down hard against the polished floor, his cane clattering away from him, a sharp cry tearing out of him, as Trent's forearm struck across his ribs with a force meant for someone standing, not someone who had just placed his own frail body directly in harm's way. Charlie Weston dropped to his knees beside his friend's security, finally closing in around Trent, wrestling him to the ground amid a chorus of shouted commands. But Weston barely registered any of it, his hands hovering over Charlie's chest, terror closing his throat. "Charlie, look at me. Stay with me." "I'm fine," Charlie gasped, wincing, one hand pressed to his ribs, though his face had gone pale with pain. "Bruised, not broken, I think. Wouldn't be the first time." A weak, breathless laugh escaped him despite everything. "Guess this old leg's finally good for something besides slowing me down." Weston's eyes burned gratitude and horror, and love tangled together so completely he couldn't separate them, staring at the friend who had just taken a blow meant for him without a second's hesitation. The same friend who had spent 2 decades watching his back from behind a desk, never once asking for recognition, never once wavering. Near the altar, a commotion rose from the back of the hall, and every head turned as a new figure pushed through the scattering crowd. A woman in her 60s, elegant, composed, despite the chaos around her, her face pale with an urgency that had nothing to do with concern for the fallen man on the floor, and everything to do with the unraveling of a plan she had waited years to see succeed. Weston looked up, and the room seemed to tilt beneath him a second time that day. "Mother," he said, the word coming out strangled 20 years of grief and betrayal colliding in a single syllable, as Margaret Kane stood frozen at the edge of the wreckage of everything she and Derek had built, watching for the first time in 2 decades, the son she had abandoned, kneeling on the floor, beside the only person in the world who had ever truly stood between him and harm. Margaret Kane did not move for a long moment, standing at the edge of the wreckage in the banquet hall, watching security hall Trent Callahan to his feet in handcuffs, watching her son kneel on the floor beside a friend who had just taken a blow meant for him. 20 years of carefully rehearsed justifications rose in her throat and found in that moment nowhere left to go. "Weston," she said again, softer, this time taking one uncertain step forward. "I can explain." "Can you?" Weston rose slowly, helping Charlie to his feet with careful hands before turning to face the mother he had spent 2 decades believing dead, grieving a version of loss that had at least offered him the mercy of an ending. This a living woman who had chosen silence, who had let Derek use her own reactivated trust to fund a scheme against her son, offered no such mercy at all. 20 years, Mother. 20 years I told myself you must have had a reason good enough to justify never once reaching out. I built a version of you in my head I could forgive. And the whole time you were choosing this instead. Your father took everything from me in that divorce, Margaret said, her composure cracking at last, old bitterness spilling out unguarded. The company, the house, you. I had nothing left to fight with Weston. Derek offered me a way back. A way back into hurting your own son, Weston said quietly, and something in his voice, not rage now but a grief so complete it had settled into something almost calm, seemed to land harder than any anger could have. I'm not going to spend what's left of my life carrying your bitterness as if it were mine to fix. I hope someday you find peace that doesn't require destroying someone else to get it. But I can't be part of how you find it. Not anymore. He turned from her before she could answer, and Margaret Kane, for the first time in 2 decades, watched her son walk away without reaching after him, understanding perhaps for the first time exactly what she had traded away. Across the hall, Olivia stood frozen amid the scattering guests, her mother's hand still gripping her arm, her mind struggling to hold all of it at once. The man she loved, revealed as a billionaire, her father's death finally explained a wedding. Interrupted, a stranger's mother, confronted and dismissed within the same 5 minutes. Weston crossed the room toward her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the enormity of everything sitting unspoken between them. I should have told you from the beginning, he said finally. I was so afraid of losing what we had that I let the lie run longer than it should have. I'm sorry, Olivia. For all of it. Olivia searched his face for a long moment, and whatever she found there, the same gentleness, the same aching honesty that had first made her carry a stranger in from the snow, seemed to answer something in her that words couldn't. "You came back for me," she said quietly. "Even after everything. You still came." "I will always come back for you," he said. That part was never the lie. In the weeks that followed, the truth unfolded publicly and completely. Derek Kane was arrested on charges connected to fraud conspiracy and the falsified maintenance records tied to Robert Hendricks's death 15 years earlier. The case, built patiently and carefully by Charlie Donovan's tireless work, finally strong enough to hold. Trent Callahan, facing his own charges, cooperated fully once the shell company's true ownership became public record, unwilling to carry the weight of Derek's plan alone. The trust fund quietly established for Diane Hendricks became at last something she could accept without shame, not charity but long overdue justice, delivered with an apology spoken plainly and without excuse. Charlie recovered fully within a few weeks. His bruised ribs healing faster than his pride allowed him to admit needed healing at all, and Weston made him formally and publicly co-owner of Kane Milling Company, not as a reward for one act of courage in a banquet hall, but as recognition of two decades spent quietly holding up a friendship neither of them had ever needed to explain. And on a clear spring afternoon months later, in the same small apartment where Olivia had once wrapped a stranger in her grandmother's hand-stitched blanket, Weston knelt on the floor. She had carried him across and asked her to marry him not as the chairman of an empire but as the man she had chosen to save before she ever knew his name was worth anything at all. "I would have said yes to you with nothing," Olivia whispered, tears bright in her eyes. "You know that." "I know," Weston said, smiling through his own. "That's exactly why it had to be you." Their wedding, when it finally came, was small, a backyard, string lights, Diane crying openly through the entire ceremony, Charlie standing at Weston's side leaning only lightly on his cane, Brianna, who had finally confessed the truth about the broken phone months earlier and been quietly, completely forgiven, catching the bouquet and laughing through her own tears. There was no gold, no grand ballroom, no headline photographers. There was only a man who had once believed love simply left, learning slowly and completely that it could also choose to stay. There is a lesson at the heart of this story that has nothing to do with fortunes or hidden identities, and everything to do with something far simpler and far harder to practice: that kindness given without any expectation of return is never wasted, even when the person receiving it seems to have nothing at all to give back. Olivia Hendricks did not carry a stranger in from the snow because she calculated what it might one day cost or earn her. She did it because it was the right thing to do, in a moment when almost no one else would have stopped. And that single choice, small, quiet, unwitnessed by anyone who mattered, became the thread that eventually unraveled a conspiracy, healed a mother's 15-year-old grief, and gave a broken, guarded man somewhere safe to finally set down the weight he'd been carrying alone. This story also reminds us that the wounds we carry from our family's abandonment, betrayal, grief we never got the chance to properly grieve, do not have to define who we become. Weston Kane could have let his mother's absence and his cousin's greed turn him bitter and closed. Instead, he chose again and again to answer cruelty with responsibility and grief with the quiet, patient work of making things right. And Charlie Donovan reminds us that true loyalty rarely announces itself loudly. It simply shows up again and again in the smallest and largest moments alike, until one day it steps between the people we love and the danger they never saw coming. If this story moved you even a little, we would love to know, what is the lesson you personally took away from it? Was it about the power of unconditional kindness, about the courage it takes to forgive or the courage it takes to walk away when forgiveness isn't yours to give? Was it about the quiet, steady loyalty of a true friend, or a mother's grief, or the healing power of being loved exactly as you are, without needing to prove you deserve it first? Please share your thoughts in the comments below this video. We read every single one, and your reflections mean more to this community than you know. If you found value in this story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Leave a comment telling us what touched you most, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and for letting these words find a place in your heart. We'll see you again in the next video.